Hi there, my name is Annisa. I'm currently a lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Thanks so much for this opportunity. Before I start the presentation proper, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm currently living and working in Melbourne, Australia, on what was always and always will be the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It is such an honor to be invited to speak at Inusharts conference organized by Fakultas Ilmu Pengetahuan Budaya Universitas Indonesia. So honored to be invited not just as a scholar, but also as an alumna of the faculty. I'm also looking forward to further discuss about the topic of this panel on gender, technology, and new media. My presentation will look into the ways in which we could be critical of and at the same time make use of new media to promote gender equality, especially in times of crisis like we are having right now. I will focus specifically on the practices of digital feminist public pedagogy amongst young women in Indonesia. That new media representations are highly gendered, perhaps for most of you is not, news, or that's not a new thing to hear about. In fact, different kinds of representations are gendered, be it political representation, cultural, economic, and so on. What I'm most interested in and what I'm going to share with you, rather, is a reflection based on my ongoing digital ethnographic project of young feminist groups in Indonesia, particularly, and in Southeast Asia generally. Feminism is on the rise, one could say. Everywhere we look, there's a discussion about feminism. You hear about feminism in Beyonce's song, if you listen to Beyonce, or read about feminism on social media and online articles. A lot of celebrities, be it local celebrities in Indonesia or international, seemingly today are becoming more and more aware and perhaps to some degrees are involved in feminist causes or gender empowerment causes. Coming from the context of North America and Europe, Professor Sarah Bennett Weiser, in her book Empowered, observes that feminism is today visibly popular in three ways. One, she said, we start to see feminist discourses and practices in popular and commercial media, and of course, social media is included here. Two, feminism is now generally admired and seen as a righteous moral cause, which is a very different reality than it used to be 30, 40 years ago. Three, it is popular in a sense that different kinds of feminism start to gain audience. And in a way, the popularity of feminism itself becomes a site of struggle. In Southeast Asia, feminist politics spearheaded by young women has also been on the rise with the help of social media, obviously, and digital technologies. For example, there's Girl Gang in Manila, Philippines, the local Rebel in Singapore, and Indonesia, you may have heard of Lawan Patriarki, among many others like Indonesia Feminist, Jakarta Feminist, Cirebon Feminist, and so on. It is important to say, though, that although we often hear that feminism comes from the West, this popular saying, feminisme itu budaya barat, Indonesia in particular and Southeast Asia, of course, has had a long and rich history of feminist and women's movements for at least 100 years now, depending on how you would like to draw the line of history. And new media today, of course, has helped speed up the popularity of feminism among Indonesian youth. The rising internet access and uses of smartphones among young people opens up opportunity for them to ask questions that are often left unanswered in schools, or important topics often left up in the air, one could say, by their parents or by their siblings or family members. Of course, I understand internet and social media is both a boon and a bane to access to information. Among young women in particular, it opens a way to find answers on topics or questions related to gender, sex, sexuality, and other seemingly taboo topics. And it gives, both information and misinformation. But in any case, new media, and specifically here, online articles and social media accounts, are the key sources of information for young people. The social media account of Lawan Patriarchy, a young feminist group I'm currently working with, shows exactly just that. I've been with them doing digital ethnographic work since their beginnings in September 2018, when their followers were sort of in mere thousands, one could say, before it quickly grew in late 2019, following Indonesia's student-led protests in September. And as it stands now, it has more than 180,000 followers. Their Instagram feed, if you have the time, please take a look. Um, is filled with discussions that address gender inequalities and then issues on sex and sexuality, including more serious discussions like sexual abuse and Indonesian laws and regulations, as well as political issues related to gender empowerment and treatments of sexual abuse. So in other words, they actively post explainers of current issues, as well as foundational definitions related to gender, sexuality, and feminism to educate their followers. So let me give you some examples. So they actively address topics that are rarely discussed, such as microaggressions against females, women in general, or gendered people who are marginalized, including LGBTQIA+. And they use language, tones, and visual representations that are accessible and relevant. They encourage self-love and capacity to subvert gendered social expectations. They also actively shared unfortunate and sad realities of sexual abuse amongst young people that many adults, especially in Indonesia and many parts of the world, often treat and prefer to see as a serious discussion that children or young people could not be involved in. And therefore, it's been rarely addressed that, children abuse, young people, sexual abuse is really there and it's quite rampant. They also discuss about gender rights and women's rights in very accessible ways, in languages that can be understood by many. Of course, sometimes in English, but more often than not, they speak in Indonesian, they use Indonesian language, and it is accessible to more people. And they even include very, very useful explainers. Sometimes they cite other sources of RUU PKS or the anti-sexual violence bill that is, the fight is still ongoing until today. Things like this you don't commonly see actually for as shared by, maybe government institutions or more formal organizations. So returning to the focus of my presentation on the use of new media to promote gender equality, especially in time of crisis, I'm arguing here that new media, as used by young feminists, just like the example of Lawan Patriarchy that I just showed you, and of course there are many others, may help address the ongoing crisis we are experiencing with the pandemic, specifically the gender and abuse that are unfortunately rampant during the pandemic. So we're talking beyond the health element of the COVID-19 pandemic, but what I'm more interested in is how the gendered impact of staying at home, of the lockdown. Reports after reports have shown these unfortunate occurrences even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So here we can define crisis not just related to health crisis, but also really gender violence crisis in Indonesia. Komnas Perempuan has shown that the numbers of reported violence against women in Indonesia continue to increase annually. So in this sense then, reminders, information, explainers about basic things, things that are basic for people who are very educated, but of course not basic for most common people. So these explainers about what sexual abuse actually entails, what it means, how it looks like, and how relationship could be toxic and so on, especially in times of lockdown and shelter in place like what we are experiencing now, should not and cannot be undermined. So what I'm trying to propose here is that social media and feminist groups like Lawan Patriarchy and many others are opening a platform for what Caitlin Mendez, Jessica Ringrose, and Jesselyn Keller have called digital feminist public pedagogy. So feminist social media accounts open access to education, especially amongst young women, to learn from each other, although they are strangers, in non-formal conditions and settings outside school and universities, and allowing, in other words, a form of public pedagogy. So what is a public pedagogy? A public pedagogy does not necessarily have to follow a model of, the normative or moralistic education. Rather, a pedagogy that is public in itself relies on a heterogeneous or diverse understanding of what is important, what is worth sharing, what is socially and culturally urgent to be understood, rather, than following rigid sets of curriculums or syllabus. So public pedagogy is important, especially in times when the boundaries of public and private spaces are reconfigured, not only by digital media, but also through governance, especially as we see in times of pandemic, where our lives, even in our own homes, continue to be managed, controlled, regulated by the government. So this type of digital feminist public pedagogy, I believe, is particularly beneficial in Indonesia, considering one, the lack of access to progressive histories of feminist and women's movements in Indonesia in formal education. We have to remember the rich history of Gerakan Wanita Indonesia and many others before the 1950s and early 1900s have been actively erased in formalized history as well as in histories and books that students and children read in their schools. Two is the literal lack of space for young women and youth in general to have meaningful discussion and debates, not only because of the pandemic, but because in general throughout time, we've seen that, the general public perception of young women and youth is that they cannot be taken seriously or should be treated as children rather than equals in discussions and debates. Three is the unfortunate social and cultural stigma that often is attached to terms such as feminist or feminism or gender empowerment, and also the stigma that is attached to victims of social abuse and of sexual abuse and of sexual violence. So while annually Indonesians can seek comfort in the celebration of Hari Kartini to commemorate the Javanese feminist heroine, what young women seem to crave and what social media accounts like Lawan Patriarchy provides is that access to information about what gender means, what sexuality is, and what can be done with sexuality, and topics that are seemingly have been silenced throughout their lives. So to return to the topic of how we could cope with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, I suggest that we start looking at new media more seriously. I suggest that we become more aware of the highly gendered nature of the impacts of the pandemic. I suggest we celebrate young people's and young feminist creativity and public pedagogy. That's it. Thank you very much.